God bless you. We're going to go ahead and go live and talk a little bit about Thibodaux, Louisiana in November 23rd of 1887. So I've been having this on my heart, and I wanted to really talk about this and kind of walk through and talk a little bit about Thibodaux, Louisiana, and what happened in November of 1887. It's something that's been on my heart as I've done research and been, writing about certain things and posting about certain things. This particular event that happened in 1887 on November 23rd in Thibodaux is something that just rung out to me that I just had to share and talk about. It's something that who's the people whose lives were affected by this and the things that happened, I think are things that we cannot shut up into history and just forget about. We have to understand people who risked their lives in so many ways and to understand the background behind what they did. And at the top of this, there'll be a resource that I'll be referring to. And I actually have this on my Facebook page, on my group, my Facebook page. So if you're a subscriber on Facebook, I have this available to you for free. But I'll be talking about this as well because, as you might know, I like to write, and I'm a writer, and I enjoy writing books. I enjoy writing things about history, and this event really jumped out at me. And as I talk about it, I'll just mention these are my books that I have. It's available on Amazon. They're available on my website. Stories about Black history and 10 things your child should know about reading, writing, and math from pre-K up to 5th grade. These are resources that I have. Please check them out. I ask that you support, and I ask that you share this information, and let's get into it. Let's talk about it. So Thibodaux, Louisiana is a place that maybe you're familiar with, maybe you're not. If you think about Louisiana and the southern part of Louisiana in the southern part of the United States, you find an area where, at the end of the Civil War and after the end of slavery and towards the end of slavery, sugarcane is a very important industry. And sugarcane is something that's bringing people a lot of money in Thibodaux and in the southern part of Louisiana during slavery and right after slavery. So when we talk about what's going to happen here, when we talk about Thibodaux, we're really talking about, in addition to what African Americans were facing, we're also talking about union rights and labor rights and how African Americans would be treated and interact with their employers, if you will, once slavery was over. So there becomes a labor aspect to this, and it becomes a union aspect and also a racist aspect that's a part of it as well. So that does not elude itself and walk away from this particular situation that happened in Thibodaux. So picture it is it's the 1880s. It's in Louisiana, and as I mentioned, one of the main things that they're growing is crops. They're growing sugarcane. So in this particular area, I don't know if you know much about sugarcane, but sugarcane is something that's very labor intensive. It requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of people to work it. That's why during slavery times you had a lot of people working in cotton fields and in sugarcane, processing sugarcane, and many other things that they were doing. And at this point in time, the workers in Louisiana and Thibodaux, some of the studies and some of the things that I read, they were making, this is only about maybe 2 decades after slavery, after the Civil War was over, they were making at this time about as little as 42 cents a day. So imagine being in a situation where you're living on a plantation, and in Louisiana at that time, there were actual laws on the books, black codes on the books that said in certain parts of Louisiana, especially in this part of Louisiana, African Americans could not walk around a town without having a pass. They had to have a pass that showed that they worked for a particular Caucasian employer in town. So that's why they were in town, or, they had business in town, and that business would have to be documented by a sheet of paper that says who they were working for. And it had to be typically a white person they were working for. In the town of Thibodaux at this time in the 1880s, African Americans were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to rent. So if you were somebody who rented or sold your property to an African American, you could be in trouble for doing so. So you could be breaking the law. So there were all kinds of rules against, carrying weapons, rules against religious rules of when they could gather, all kinds of things, how they could be out in town, what types of things they could do. And they had to be working for, as I mentioned, a Caucasian employer in order to even be in town or to be around. So imagine being in those situations. So it was an apartheid-like situation. It was a slavery-like situation that they were putting on them. And as they were working in these plantations where they may have been growing sugarcane for a period of time, as I mentioned, some folks were making as little as 42 cents a day, and they were living on the same plantations that many of them were enslaved on. So imagine you're enslaved and now you're working on the same plantation, living in the same quarters, and the same quarters that enslaved people were housed in. Many of these workers were living in those quarters and forced to live on the plantation because they couldn't rent, they couldn't own in town. They had to work where they lived. In addition to that, many of them were not given cash as a part of their payment. So instead of, if you made as little as 42 cents a day, you weren't given, a couple dollars, a few dollars every so often. You were paid in script, something they call script. And script you would use, not even money, not even cash, you would use the script to go to the plantation store to buy your needs. So if you needed food or some type of feed or basic clothes or basic necessities, you would use your script and trade it in for resources that you need at the plantation store. And so you had a situation where people were basically there enslaved. They were indebted to people. They were enslaved. They were being treated unfairly, and they were being locked really in on this plantation system with the use of force. So you can't go anywhere. You can't own land. You can't rent. You can't own a business. You really have a difficult time of leaving town. If you leave town, where do you go? All those things were challenges that were happening. So what happened was in the 1870s and in the 1880s, African Americans in Thibodaux and in that area and the parishes surrounding that area decided to strike. There were sugarcane workers who said, we're basically living on starvation wages. We're working 12-hour days, 12 hours a day. We're getting paid, cents a day, and we can't even eat off of this. We can barely live. We need to have better living conditions and better working conditions. So they tried to strike in the 1870s. They were met with force. They tried again in around 1880 or so. They were met with force, and they tried again in 1887, and the force was even more overwhelming now. And the challenge was, they would stand up and say, we want to have better living conditions. We want to be able to be paid in cash and not in script, because that's just a way to basically manipulate them and to keep them forever in debt. And the owners didn't even really have to have cash because they just paid them in script. They didn't even have to have cash, and so they were in a situation where they were asking for, instead of as little as 42 cents a day, to raise their pay to about $1.25 a day. That's what they were asking for. Well, the challenge was that many of the planters there didn't want to do that. They did not want to give any of the African Americans any of these demands that they were asking for. And what they did was they went to the governor. Now, when we're talking about the southern part of Louisiana, we're talking about some rich planters. We're not talking about just anybody. We're talking about rich planters. We're talking big plantations, even some small and mid-sized, but also large plantations as well. And there's one man, his name was Edward Douglas White. I encourage you to look him up. He was somebody who would become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He would become a member of the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was born in Thibodaux. His family were planters. They were slaveholders, and he was a planter and a slaveholder and a planter after the Civil War. And he was one of the people who was a plantation owner during this time as this riot and these strikes were going on in Thibodaux. And one of the things he and other planters did, this is how they did it, they began to kick the people off of their land. So if you were a striker and you said, we're going to go on strike, we're not going to work unless you give us better wages and better conditions. And the problem was, this was happening around November, October, November timeframe, August through November. And that was a time where sugarcane needed to be processed in a certain way. So apparently not only are you harvesting the sugarcane, but you're grinding it and you're doing things to process it. And it's very labor intensive. And the planters weren't going to do it themselves. So they weren't going to do it themselves. So they needed people to do this. And so at a crucial point in time in the whole processing session, if you will, for sugarcane, people were deciding to strike because they were, that's the best time to do it because we want to demand better conditions. You guys are not listening to us. So the planters would go to the governor, and there were several governors over this period of time, over the years that this was leading up to, who all basically sided on the side of the planters. And what they would do is they would say, hey, look, this is crazy, this is threatening our livelihoods. And then they started to say, this is threatening our lives. The African Americans, they're planning to attack us. They're going to attack our women. And many of the other men, just like this gentleman right here, who is a Civil War veteran, this is an unknown soldier. He's a Civil War soldier. Many of the people there were Union Civil War people. They were veterans. They were not all, just civilians completely. They were Civil War veterans as well. And so they were concerned that these men and or the women would somehow riot, and this strike was not only threatening their livelihoods, but it was threatening their very lives and their very existence. And that's what they told. And the governor believed them and bought into that. And what they did was the people in town, they began to organize militias. And the militias that they organized people to come who would be basically under the command of a former Confederate general who was P.G.T. Beauregard. So there were several white militias that were organized, and they were put under the charge, as I mentioned, of a former Confederate general. And they were in town and in the area of Thibodaux to put down the rioters and to quell any type of violence or any type of strike busting or any type of conflict that would take place. And so what you had was the planters being able to say, hey, I don't want you on my land if you're going to strike. Get out, kick you off. And as I just mentioned, if you got kicked off the plantation and you got kicked out of work, you were not just being kicked out of work, you were being kicked out of the place where you live. And you were supposed to have a pass just to be in towns in many of these places. So to kick someone off of their place of employment and out of their home, therefore, meant basically homelessness for them, and meant that they could be charged or attacked or abused in some way because they were not having the proper papers to even be in town, because anybody could ask them, where are your papers if you were African American? So many of the people who were kicked off of these plantations in the 1880s, in particular 1887, as we're leading up to this event, they ended up living on the side of the road. They ended up they got kicked off of plantations around Thibodaux. They ended up going to other places and going into Thibodaux and staying in campsites on the side of the road because they had no place to stay, because they were kicked off of their employer's plantation for wanting to or even thinking about striking. And so what some of the people did, what some of the planters did, is they ended up bringing in people from Mississippi, from Vicksburg, some 200 miles away, to help break and bust the strike. And so not only were they kicking people off and basically making them homeless and saying, get out of here, and having the militia to back them up, they ended up bringing people who were strike busters in from Mississippi. And these people were from maybe 200 miles away in Vicksburg, and they didn't know as much about, sugarcane and the process around sugarcane as the people who were there in Louisiana and used to doing it. So there were some challenges there. And as tension rose and as certain African Americans wanted people to strike and some people were afraid to strike, you had conflicts that would take place. And sometimes either the planters would be violent or the employees would be challenged. And when there was a conflict, typically the planter had obviously the law and the authorities on his side. And the militia would come to the plantations, and they would actually fire upon African Americans or fire in support of the planters. So here you had people who barely had anything, barely had any weapons, barely had any organization, didn't have any money. They were poor. They had no homes except for the homes that their employers were forcing them to stay in, which used to be slave cabins, enslaved people's homes. And here they had nothing, and they were facing now a militia. One of the things the militia did several of the militias did as this crescendo began to build is that they brought into the town of Thibodaux, they brought in a Gatling gun. They actually brought in a Gatling gun as well as a cannon, as a military style cannon. And you may be familiar with a Gatling gun. It's one of those ones that you crank and you turn, and you could do a lot of damage with that. So they brought that into the town square, and they were basically intimidating the people who wanted to strike. And as this began to come to a crescendo, there were several African American leaders who had been calling for a strike and organizing. And as I mentioned, each time they went to organize, each time they did it over the years, they were met with force, and they would end up having the strike busted because violence would take place, because people were doing this with their lives on the line. And they ended up reaching out to a group called the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was a nationwide union. They were a nationwide force, the organization that was helping to organize various people and workers into bargaining units. So they were segregated. They were a segregated organization, but they did also take in farmers and women into their ranks and organized bargaining units. So they had segregated bargaining units, in particular for African Americans. And so they were working with many of the African American leaders were working with the Knights of Labor to help organize bargaining units in Thibodaux and in this part of southern Louisiana. But the challenge was, you were not going to do this in Louisiana. You were not going to do this in 1887 in Louisiana. And so as time went on and the angst got there, the ante was up. And what happened was the judge in the town of Thibodaux ended up declaring martial law. And they cordoned off areas. They were stopping African Americans, seeing if you had papers. And one day on November 23rd, which is a day that lives in infamy, if you will, on November 23rd, two Caucasian guards who were at a certain part of a road that ended in a certain area in Thibodaux were shot. They were shot, they believe, by African American men, they think. And the shots came from the woods, and they believe they were African American people who shot them. One guy got shot in the mouth. Another person was shot in the leg several times. And the history goes, the guards who were with them took them, someplace else so they could get help, so they could be treated. And they told, the townspeople that African American men had shot these Caucasian, these white guards. And so all heck broke loose. The militia that were there, and we're talking hundreds of people in the militia, not just like 1 or 2 or 10 or 20. We're talking about hundreds of people that were organized into companies of militia that were heavily armed and under the force of an ex-Confederate general. And they had, weaponry, like I said, a Gatling gun, they had a cannon. And what they ended up doing is they ended up going door to door. They ended up going house to house to African-American homes on these plantations and pulling people out of their homes. They pulled people out of their homes and shot them right on the spot. This was not a situation where the people were attacking anybody. This was not, the people were in their homes, and they were literally taken by authorities and people who were deputized and people who were militia and dragged out of their homes and killed right there on the spot. One man, his name was Jack Conrad, and he was a former Union veteran. He was a Civil War veteran. He was an American veteran. He was dragged and taken out of his house. He was taken out of his house along with his young son, whose name was Grant, and his brother-in-law. Now, his brother-in-law was arguing as the people were pulling him out. He was saying, I had nothing to do with the strike. I wasn't on strike. I had nothing to do with it, but that didn't matter. They shot him anyway. And they killed him. When it came to Grant, Jack Conrad's son, they took him out back, and he tried to run. He tried to hide behind a barrel and to get behind the barrel to protect himself, but that didn't matter. They killed that young man anyway. They shot him anyway. And then when it came to Jack Conrad, he ended up getting shot several times, the Civil War veteran, in the chest and in his legs. And he ended up crawling up underneath the house where he lived. And that's the only thing that saved him. That's how he was able to survive. And that's one of the reasons why we have records about it, is because he survived to tell the story about it, as well as several others. But they ended up killing a lot of people that day, just murdering them right there on the street. Another man who was a strike organizer, one of the organizers of the strike, he ended up being found in his house, and he was hiding in the attic, and they took him down. They drug him out of the attic. They took him to the town square, to the town common area where there were militia set up and the Gatling gun and all that there. They took him there, and they had him stand in the middle of town, and they told him to run. They told him to run, that he better run. And he started running, and a firing squad opened up on him and just shot him. Just shot him full of holes as he ran, unarmed, running away by their command, and he got shot by the firing squad. And this is the kind of thing that happened on November 23rd, 1887 in Thibodaux, Louisiana. And one of the things that folks are looking at now, and some archaeologists, is that they believe that as many as 60 African Americans were killed that day, and that they were put in a mass grave, that they were buried in a mass grave that they were trying to find. I'm not sure if they found it yet, but they are looking for it. They have been looking for it. But you imagine 60 people being killed, being shot down. There were a lot of things in terms of unionizing going on around the country at this time. But the idea of killing people and putting them in a mass grave and just dumping stuff on top of them is incredible, and it's amazing. It's something that we should talk about. Our children should talk about. Our children should know. And we should understand that the people who lived in Thibodaux, who fought for rights right after slavery, who fought for unionizing rights, should be remembered. Things happened to them that didn't happen to other people who were organizing in terms of union, but we should remember them. I believe they were heroes, and they're somebody should remember. So thank you so much for listening. Please share this with somebody. Please talk to somebody about it, and let me know if you have any questions.